In episode 7 part 2, I touched on the subject of keyframes when I adjusted them to compensate for a change in event length or an increase in text string length. In this episode I want to explore the subject further and talk about keyframe interpolation modes. For those unfamiliar with the term, keyframe interpolation is simply the transition of a keyframe parameter's value between adjacent keyframes. Interpolation modes describe how that transition behaves. They come in two flavors, temporal and spatial, and I'll be explaining the difference between the two types. I'll also describe visually their use. A temporal interpolation mode determines how a parameter's value changes over time from one keyframe to the next. There are 6 possible temporal interpolation modes. They are activated with the 6 icons at the top of the editor timeline. These icons are only enabled for a particular selected events parameter when that parameter is keyframed. They are grayed out otherwise. The 6 available interpolation modes are as follows. Linear. This is the default mode and causes the rate of change between adjacent keyframes to be constant. Constant. Changing a keyframe's interpolation mode to constant freezes the parameter's value at that keyframe until the next keyframe. Smooth. This mode causes a negative rate of change before the keyframe and positive after. This results in a smooth transition. Smooth in. This causes a negative rate of change before the keyframe. The rate of change after the keyframe is unaffected. Smooth out. The opposite to smooth in. The rate of change after the keyframe is positive. The rate of change before the keyframe is unaffected. Manual Bezier. In this mode, the smoothing effect can be controlled using Bezier handles. If you're unfamiliar with Bezier handles, I'll be giving more detail later on. To demonstrate the different modes, I'll use a text events opacity parameter. I could have used any of the events parameters that can be keyframed, but the opacity parameter is easy to visualize and easy to keyframe. The line running along the event is the opacity control. Hover the mouse over the line and a label appears displaying the current opacity values as a percentage. You can adjust the opacity of the complete event by simply clicking on it and dragging down. The label reappears as you drag and displays the updated opacity value. This method is fine if you just want the new opacity to be constant. However, if you want the value to change through the event's duration, you have to use keyframes. To keyframe an event's opacity, you simply hover the mouse over the line where you want the keyframe to be, then press and hold the Control key. The cursor will change to a cross. You then left-click on the mouse and a keyframe will be generated at that point. At this point, the generated keyframe will be selected, causing it to be highlighted. It's a little difficult to see the highlighting, but the selection will also result in the 6 interpolation mode icons at the top of the editor timeline to be highlighted. To demonstrate interpolation, I'll create another 2 keyframes and pull the 2 outer ones down. At the moment, all three keyframes have an interpolation mode of linear, indicated by the first of the modes being highlighted. I'll now change the interpolation mode of the middle keyframe to constant. You'll notice that the keyframe icon changes to reflect the change in mode. As I mentioned earlier, the constant mode will retain the value of the selected keyframe until the next keyframe is reached. The value will then change abruptly to the value of that keyframe. Next is the smooth mode. Notice the circle connected to the keyframe by a dotted line. The line is called a Bezier handle, and the circle is called a control point. I'll be dealing with Bezier handles later on. The smooth in mode comes next. The smooth out mode has the opposite effect to the smooth in mode. The final temporal mode is manual Bezier. As I mentioned earlier, the dotted lines attached to the keyframe are called Bezier handles, and the circles at the end are called control points. You can use these to determine the rate of change between the selected keyframe and adjacent ones. For instance, if I click on the handle at the right-hand side of the keyframe and move it upwards, the line changes shape. Note that I can't take the line higher than the maximum opacity value of 100%. Moving the handle laterally to the right causes the curve to start later. As you can see, by default the handles work independently. However, they can be made to work in unison, but in opposite directions. This ensures that the curve at the keyframe is always a smooth one. To demonstrate this, I need to open the timeline display for the control panel. This is done by clicking the display timeline icon at the top right of the control panel. I now need to display the parameter in graphical form. This is achieved by clicking on the display graph icon. With the middle keyframe selected, I'll change its interpolation mode to manual Bezier. As before, this will place two Bezier handles either side of the keyframe. These by default move independently. To get them to move in unison, they need to be locked together. This is done by right-clicking one of the control points and selecting Lock Temporal Control Points. Now, if I move one of the control points, the other moves with it, but in the opposite direction. This ensures a smooth transition through the keyframe. By the way, if you find that the graph is cut off, it can be scrolled vertically using the scroll bar at the right-hand side. If the scroll bar isn't visible, enable it by clicking on the small magnifying glass icon at the top right of the timeline display. What is spatial interpolation? The clue is in the word spatial. Whereas temporal interpolation determines our keyframe parameter's value changes over time, spatial interpolation determines our object's motion path changes over time. There are three spatial interpolation modes: linear, auto Bezier, which is the default mode, and manual Bezier. To demonstrate the different modes, I'll place a text event onto the timeline and type the letter A. I'm now going to animate the position of the letter in two-dimensional space. This creates a number of keyframes, and because I've moved the letter in space, the interpolation here is spatial. Also, as you can see, the default spatial interpolation mode of auto Bezier causes the change in direction at keyframes to be smooth. If you can't see the keyframes or the path, make sure that the Show Motion Path icon is enabled. To see what mode a keyframe is set to, right-click it and hover over Spatial Interpolation. The mode can be changed from this list. As with temporal interpolation, described previously, the Bezier handles can be made to work together and in opposite direction. To do this, select Lock Spatial Control Points from the context list. In Auto Bezier mode, this option isn't available. If you move either of the Bezier control points, the mode changes to manual Bezier. The option now becomes available. The temporal interpolation mode of keyframes can be changed as well. This is best demonstrated by changing one to constant. The letter holds position until the next keyframe, then it jumps to the new position. In this case, the Bezier handle to the right of the keyframe has no effect on the graph. This is because there's no movement between the two keyframes. As with temporal interpolation, spatial interpolation changes can be made within the control panel's timeline display. Because the letter is moving in two-dimensional space, there are two plots on the graph. The red plot corresponds to its position on the x-axis, and the green plot corresponds to its position on the y-axis. The right-click context menu has the usual options plus a few more. One that's not obvious is the Toggle Keyframes option. Choosing this option will place additional keyframes on both plots at the playhead time value. If this option is chosen when the playhead is over keyframes, these keyframes will be deleted. In episode 7 part 1 I used keyframes to animate a text string onto the screen, then back off again. Because the keyframes had the default linear mode applied, the animation started and stopped abruptly. Applying the appropriate modes to the keyframes would have made the animations much smoother. As always, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so. Until the next time, bye for now.